Hi everyone, welcome to the next lecture in the series Imperial Power in the Roman World. We're very fortunate today to have an incredibly esteemed historian, someone whose name I suspect many of you will recognize. This is Professor David Potter. He's a specialist in Roman imperial history, Greek and Latin epigraphy, and ancient historiography. He is the Francis W. Kelsey Collegiate Professor of Greek and Roman History and Arthur F. Thurno Professor in the Department of Classical Studies at the University of Michigan. He's written a large number of books and articles that have challenged contemporary scholarly perspectives and advanced new ways of interpreting and studying the Roman Empire. David's two most recent monographs reflect his dynamic approach to ancient history, The Origin of Empire, Rome from the Republic to Hadrian, and Disruption, Why Things Change. In the first, David presents a new reading of Roman government, tracing its development from contractor state to bureaucratic monarchy. And in the second, he draws upon a number of case studies to investigate the drastic change brought about by the collapse of political authority. David is also co-editing the 11-volume Oxford History of the Roman World. So today, David is very kindly agreed to give a lecture on Hadrian, titled Running the Empire, Petition, Response and Policy. And the subject of the talk will be focused upon the administration of the Roman Empire, in particular, recognizing how it could work ideally for both the governed and its rulers through a constant dialogue between the emperors and their subjects. The fact that so much evidence for the working of government consists of imperial responses to local requests has suggested perhaps that government tended to be responsive rather than proactive. And the publication of a collection of letters from the Emperor Hadrian on the subject of public entertainment can, however, show how the imperial government manipulated that dialogue to dictate coherent policy across the vast empire, and that this perhaps can enable us to see how proactive discursive government could be. And with that, David, I hand it over to you.
Okay, Anthony, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you all today. It seems to me that when we think about the model of Roman government that Anthony was just talking about, we owe it, of course, to Fergus Miller and his wonderful book on the Emperor and the Roman World. But what Professor Miller was arguing for was a very passive approach to government. He didn't feel that the Roman state could develop long-term policies. And there's a lot here that is worth thinking about and considering. First of all, what do we mean in any case by long-term? Any kind of government that adopts a policy is going to be adopting a policy in response to or an immediate set of circumstances. And a long-term solution could range from building a wall from one side of an island to another that will remain there for hundreds of years and define a frontier policy. Or it can simply be a tendency to reduce taxes so cities can repair themselves in the wake of an earthquake. So in that case, a policy that's going to be no more than a year or so. It really depends on what we're talking about and what the government is trying to accommodate. And one thing that I think is very important about the Roman Empire, a basic question in Roman history, is why did the empire last so long? And I think that the reason it did that was precisely because of the sort of dialectical way that the Roman government had of making policy. That policy is made in response to actual situations. And the letters of Hadrian on public entertainment enable us to see in a way how this is done. There are three letters in this dossier, one of which is really just a collection of different individual rulings, which nonetheless adds up to a very consistent statement about the obligations of cities to entertainers, and also of the real importance of these games to the imperial system of government, that these are seen as a basic venue for the government to make contact with its subjects. And one of the things that we will see as we think about the first dossier here is that quite often it is implicit that there will be an official of the government that's going to be present at these games. And if you want to approach the imperial power, you don't have to go to Rome to do it. You simply have to go to the games and meet the official who's there. And we can also see occasions where officials are being very careful in dealing with very powerful local individuals. But the first of these letters, Hadrian says, and just to keep in mind who Hadrian was, of course, he was the emperor from 118 to 138. Sorry, that's 117 to 138. And he traveled the empire extensively and really had a very good knowledge of what this world looked like that he was running. So here he says, I order, as emperor, that's what he does, that all the games shall be held and that a city shall not divert the funds established for games according to law, decree, or testamental foundation for some other expenditure, nor do I permit some building project to be constructed with the money that ought to pay for the prizes of the contestants or travel expenses to victors. So in that case, of course, we can see that Hadrian has a pretty good sense of what can go on with these foundations and differing cities. And then he says, when, however, city is in distress and must find revenue, not for luxury or feasting, but to purchase grain during a famine, then write to me. For without my permission, it is in no way permissible to spend for any such purpose the funds that are set aside for games. But again, if you've got a problem, the place you go to solve your problem is going to be through the emperor. And then he goes on here, says, it is not only unjust, but as a certain twisting or dishonesty to announce games, invite contestants, and then when they have arrived, either to cancel the event immediately, or after opening the event, or after some part of the contest to break off the festival in the middle, because again, the best contestants, the people you want to have come to your game, are going to be traveling at some expense to themselves, and Hadrian feels that they should be able to be paid back for the expense that they've gone to come and entertain you. Now, in another one of these cases, and we can see there's a question of the way that communication is mediated here. He says, I have sent the accounts of the Corinthians to the proconsul and have written that he should, as fast as possible, examine the contents and make a declaration about the strength of the public revenue as to whether the sacred victors should receive 2/3 or half. Until the Corinthians give information concerning their reasons, they shall pay 2/3. But here, in this case, we can see that the city of Corinth has clearly run into financial problems and we can't pay what we promised in this case. And the emperor is telling them to go to the governor and work through their accounts with him to determine what it is they're going to have to pay, and they're going to have to pay more if they don't do this quickly. But the other implication is they do what he says, they can save themselves a certain amount of money. And a further letter here, he says, I've written to Publius Marcellus, my honored friend and the governor of Syria, that he shall make sure that the prize money for the contest held at Apamea will be given to the victors, which you say that Alexianos, the person in charge of the festival, has withheld. Now, you might ask, why does Publius Marcellus feel he has to write to the emperor to make sure that a local official has to pay the money that he owes? Well, in this case, we know something about the family of Alexianus of Apamea in Syria. He is very well connected with the Roman Senate. His granddaughter will actually ultimately become the Empress, Julia Domna. So this is a family that is very much on the rise. And the governor is a bit leery about messing with this family. So he goes to Hadrian to get his support in dealing with a very powerful local. Now, in the next section along here, he tells us that the payments for victors will be owed not only on the day that one should make his victorious entry into his homeland, but rather from the day on which the letters concerning the victory were delivered to their home cities. And it will be permitted to those going on to other contests to send the documentation. Now, in this case, we have another ruling on exactly the same subject from Hadrian's predecessor, the Emperor Trajan, who was ruled from 98 to 117. And in this case, a governor, the younger Pliny, is writing from Bithynia, and he says that cities don't want to start paying the awards to athletes until the athlete has actually made his triumphal entry into the city, because what is happening if you're a citizen of a city, you're a famous athlete, you've won a famous contest, you're entitled to a pension. And so the cities have come to trying to save money. As you can see, there's a lot of issue about cash in all of this, but then anytime we're talking about public entertainment at any time in any era, we're going to be talking about expenditures of large amounts of money. The cities have said that we want to save some cash and not pay until the guys actually come home. But Hadrian, who, as you can sense from what I've read to you already, is very favorable to public entertainers, is reversing the policy of his predecessor and saying, no, these payments shall be due from the day on which the person has actually won the contest. Now, when we think about how an athletic career would work, it's not always going to be very long. It's going to usually be about 4 or 5 years. And if you have to break off your contesting whatever event it is while you're at the sort of height of your ability to go back and get your pension, you're not going to win as many victories. You're not going to have as extensive a pension. And so Hadrian is going to be very sympathetic to the professional entertainers in this case, so they can have the great season, the great win at the Olympic Games, and go on to other contests in that same year. And I think Hadrian's also very conscious of the fact that what draws people to these entertainments is the star power of the athletes, just as we see when we flick on the telly to look at what's happening in Tokyo this summer. So in all of these cases, we can see a sort of general tendency of Hadrian to work to strengthen the position of these professional athletes and the association of professional athletes. In the next letter in this dossier, Hadrian is going to set out the dates of games and to reorganize the major festivals of the Roman Empire. And the preface to this letter is really fascinating. It says, "It seems to me that I should make clear to you the organization of the games, concerning which speeches and requests were made in my presence at Naples, and to write to the provinces and the cities from which embassies came to me on this topic." Now, Hadrian, having traveled around the empire, has set up a number of new festivals. And again, given the nature of ancient transportation and how fast it takes, how long it takes really to get from one place to another, cities are wondering how these different festivals are going to relate to each other. So Hadrian is now going to say, okay, you said you have a problem, and now here's the government, and I'm going to come in and make a new calendar up for the celebration of these games. And he is very detailed here. "I will begin with the Olympic Games, which is the oldest contest and the most famous of the Greek games. The Isthmian Games will be after the Olympics. The contest in honor of Hadrian will be after the Isthmian Games, so that these games may begin on the day after the end of the Eleusinian festival. And this is the first day of the new month of Mamakterion amongst the Athenians. The contest in honor of Hadrian shall last for 40 days. And what he has effectively done here is reverse the order of the Isthmian Games and the Olympic Games to begin his cycle with the Olympic Games, because that sounds a very good thing to do. And then you're going to conclude this year by celebrating Hadrian himself. And then in year 2, he says, the contest at Tarentum, after the contest in honor of Hadrian, will begin in January. The games in Naples will be held, as is currently the case, after the Capitoline Games, and then the Actian Games will be held 9 days before the Calends of October, September 23rd, and last for 40 days. According to the passage of ships, the contest at Patras, then the Heraia and the Nemea will be held between November 1st and January 1st. So here, he said, once you finish celebrating me in Greece, everybody's going to come to Tarentum. We're going to have the games there, and then you're going to cross Italy, and you're going to come up to Rome, and you'll celebrate the Capitoline Games, and then you'll go back down to Naples and celebrate those games. There's a very famous series of Greek games in Naples, and then everybody's going to get in their boats, and you're going to sail off to Actium and celebrate those games. And then once you've done that, you can see people going down the west coast of Greece to Patras, and then you're going to go across northern Greece to the Heraia, which are going to be at Argos, and the Nemean Games. And then we've got to the end of the year then, and so the next year we're going to open with a Panathenaea after the Nemean Games, and then once those games are over, you're going to go to Smyrna and celebrate those games. We're going to cross to Asia Minor, and then to Pergamum, and then to Ephesus. And the next 2 years are going to be spent celebrating games up and down the west coast of Turkey. And then we're going to start the whole thing over again. You're going to come back to Olympia and so forth. But he's got a very clear idea of the way that he wants all of this done. He's got quite a clear idea of how long he expects it's going to take for people to get one place to another. He's really being, in many ways, very practical about all of this. And he also reminds everybody that the contestants will come to all the festivals now set in order by me and in a timely fashion, because no one thinks that most people will object in regard to them. First of all festivals everywhere are contested for 40 days, and let this be so. He was regularizing everything, you see. And then if the competitors do not have to waste time seeking their prizes after the games, thus what I have established elsewhere is necessary. The silver shall be placed by the crowns in the theater and the stadium and taken immediately by the victor before the eyes of the spectator. An official in charge of the games who does not do this will owe double the amount. So the contestant will take half, and the city where the contest was held takes half as well. And this actually refers back to something in one of his earlier letters. But the whole sense here is we can take this system and we can make it move more efficiently. But in order for all of this to work, what we can also get a sense for is that Hadrian needs a lot of local knowledge. And that is what this process of petition and response is providing, is getting the information to the emperor so the emperor can make a decision. The implication here is that this is not going to be a completely ad hoc process, but rather on the basis of all of the data that he's collecting, the emperor should be able to make a policy that will work for the empire as a whole. On the other hand, what this is not is a person sitting in Rome and simply telling people in the provinces, well, you all have to do this. It's based on what he can know, and it's interesting that in again a connection with entertainment, Hadrian will write to the guild of athletes and say, yes, the place where you wish I shall order to be given to you. I'm going to give you a building, and a building is to house your archives. And if you consider the alteration of your statutes necessary, that is up to you. That he expects these associations of athletes to be self-governing. They can look after their own business, but he also expects them to have real records and to keep them efficiently. In another case, if we move away from the world of entertainments to, again, the emperor working on the basis of petitions and local knowledge. Even though in previous years, the Nile achieved not only its full rise, but the greater rise, which was almost unprecedented, and as it reached all the country, was itself the cause. The land brought forth its very plentiful and splendid crops. Nevertheless, having learned that the rise of the Nile fell short or failed completely, this time, as it did last year, I realized that it was necessary to make some considerable adjustment for the farmers, although I expect, be it said with permission of the god, that in the oncoming years, even if now some dearth has occurred, the Nile itself and the earth will compensate on account of the altering nature of things in that changes occur. Yesterday from a good flood and a plentiful crop to want, tomorrow from want to abundance. With good fortune I decree that this year's tribute in cash shall be distributed for those from the Thebaid who are most likely to have suffered from the dearth into 5 annual installments, for those from the Heptamonia into 4, from those from Lower Egypt into 3, and so on. Now, so again, what we have is the emperor responding to a natural disaster, in this case by cutting his own tax revenue from Egypt. This is a standard way that the imperial government deals with natural disasters, is simply to forgive the tax revenue. So again, there's a method to the way the government works, and it is turning to that method in these cases on the basis of local information. And as you can see, Hadrian there is also making decisions for different parts of the province of Egypt, depending on how he has been told it has been affected by the low Nile. And so the overall point here is that the government of the empire is indeed, as Professor Miller said, a process of petition and response, but that these petitions are really setting off responses of the emperor, which are pretty typical from one situation to the next. You would expect when you go to the emperor not to have some kind of completely random action saying, oh, well, today I feel that we should do it this way, and maybe tomorrow I'll feel it's something different. What Hadrian is stressing here is the consistency of the government's response to particular kinds of crises. Now, when we look at the way that the imperial government, for instance, deals with other issues, for instance, when it deals with issues affecting its relationship with its neighbors. Once again, what happens is a governor goes out with a set of instructions, and it is basically what you should do are the following things under these circumstances. But what happens if it doesn't work? You then write a letter back to the emperor, you explain what's going on, and then the emperor will authorize whatever action the emperor has decided is appropriate. And we know that the emperor ideally doesn't work alone, that he has a council of advisors, that he will often call in people who have local experience. We have, for instance, a letter of the Emperor Augustus to his heir Tiberius at the time of campaigns in the Balkans, and he mentions the fact that he's just been playing dice with a couple of other people who have had major commands in that area. So I mean, one of the processes of government is to build up the necessary expertise to provide advice. Now, this doesn't happen all the time and in all cases, but one of the typical complaints about an emperor who's going to be murdered by his associates, and usually when an emperor is assassinated, it is by members of the palace, is exactly that their behavior is not as expected, that it is in some ways eccentric. Commodus could go along being relatively inefficient. This is the son of Marcus Aurelius, memorably, of course, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in Gladiator. But he was emperor from 180, sorry, to 192, when he was assassinated at the world's worst New Year's Eve party by his closest associates. But just before that, he had in fact been acting like a gladiator. And at that point, he had become just simply too much of a menace and too unpredictable to be allowed to continue as emperor. The same sort of circumstances we can see surrounding the assassination of the Emperor Domitian. Again, he'd become unpredictable in these ways. Nero, of course, notoriously so. And once he becomes not only unpredictable, but dangerous, he effectively was signing his own death warrant, as Caligula had before him. So that there's when we think of the emperor, he often looks like he is all powerful. But in fact, we can see, I think, that there are a lot of constraints on his behavior, and that there is a real process of government that he is supposed to participate in, and that there are quite specific expectations of the way that the emperor is going to respond in different cases. And so in this way, it's this process of petition and response that builds up in the imperial system the expectations of how government would work, and helps us see exactly how the emperor functions in the Roman world. I'd like to thank you, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, David. That was a fascinating talk, and one that I think suggests a really interesting perspective on how we can frame imperial power, but also actually how we can define what it is to be an emperor in this world. And certainly, David, the idea of a petition and response creating almost like a pro forma or an expectation of behavior actually to a certain extent can be limiting. And like you say about those notably bad emperors, it is sometimes the case that they just deviate away from what is expected of them, and that's when they become unpredictable, dangerous, and of course the result often, or so often, is death, either at their own hands or the hands of their enemies within the palace.
No, well, having just watched a completely unpredictable version of the emperor in this country, I mean, it really is. The Trump administration is a particularly good illustration, of exactly the game of expectation and response.
Yeah.
I don't think we can should talk about other people's government behaving erratically.
Well, you don't have to look too far so often, David, do you? Sadly. So if we think about this then, so with someone like Hadrian, it's actually quite refreshing in many ways. At last, we've reached a good emperor of Rome, famously one of the good emperors of Rome. I've just got a few questions for you, if that's okay. So when we think about someone like Hadrian, and we think about him as this great traveler and this rather effective image, or this rather effective embodiment of imperial power, why do you think we have such a positive perspective on him? And how might that shape our understanding of what it was to be an emperor in this period?
Well, I think that what we can see is that he worked incredibly hard. And this is something that for instance, Cassius Dio comments on when writing about Marcus Aurelius. This is a man, who literally burns the midnight oil. Also, letters describing Vespasian that Pliny wrote about his uncle. You go see Vespasian, and there he gets up in the morning, he does his job, he listens to people, he then has a lunch, he takes the afternoon off, but he gets it all done. Marcus Aurelius, in the first book of the Meditations, writing about what did he learn from Antoninus Pius. He learned how to do the job, and he learned how to treat people. And he learned that your power is not absolute, and that you do have to be polite to your subjects, that you can't lose your temper in meetings, that there is a sort of school of management that is implicit in the palace. And of course, there are a lot of officials around the side, imperial freedmen, courtiers, etc., who will go from one reign to the next, and they help sort of create these sorts of expectations. And so I think that's a critical feature, really, of what's going on. I think it's not accidental that Acte, the mistress of Nero, is somebody who's a very well-established woman in the sort of corridors of the court, or Antonia Caenis, who was the mistress of Vespasian, another case, had been the freedwoman of the of Antonia the Younger, the niece of Augustus, who had in fact played a role in bringing down Sejanus back in 31. So again, she and her contacts, sort of pave the way for differing people to move into court circles.
Excellent. And in many ways, I think we have these images of emperors and we have their kind of recorded actions. But as you're alluding to now, David, we also have continuity between reigns. So courtiers who may stay, and just to quote what you just said, almost this kind of school of management. There is this kind of expected behavior then to guide potential princeps and emperors in how they should behave and how they should act. And one thing that comes through really strongly from your talk is actually the people really do matter, and not just the people in the city of Rome or the people in the immediate surrounding countryside or across Italy, the people all across the empire. So part of what you were suggesting in the talk was public entertainment matters because that is an opportunity perhaps for the emperor to speak to his people, but also to, much like we've seen this summer, with the Olympics, to respond to that kind of star quality, perhaps to keep people happy and to create something that they can actively enjoy.
Exactly. I think that the one of the things that sets the Roman Empire apart from other empires is actually the stress on having a good time being Roman.
Yeah.
That you're asked to participate in the emperor's successes. You celebrate the emperor's birthday, but also you have this enormous network of celebrities, and the celebrities are connected with the process of imperial government. So when we think about how the imperial government works, we shouldn't necessarily think about soldiers wandering around all over the place. There weren't very many of them anyway. Yeah. I mean, the Roman army, Gibbon noted ages ago, but absolutely precisely, was the same size as the army of Louis XIV. So how do you govern this vast empire with a relatively small military? It's because you can bring people along, and that what you would expect as the sort of representative is a star athlete or a star entertainer, not a guy with a sword. And I think that makes a huge difference. And so many imperial powers in more recent years have not understood that. The idea that you govern through, as it were, the prosperity and happiness of your subjects rather than the exploitation of your subjects, yeah. It was very, very widely mixed. Yeah. And I think it's not accidental that, so if I can, in the 19th century, as colonial administrators are being developed, Roman spectacle is seen as a corrupting force.
Absolutely. And again, I think what it encourages us to do is to appreciate the complexity of the Roman Empire, but also to appreciate the way in which so often this is about negotiation between a sense of whatever Rome really was, and I'm never entirely sure exactly what that is, but then also how that translates to the peripheries of that world, to the areas that are more newly Roman. And again, one thing that jumps out very strongly from your talk is that actually Hadrian, or someone very close to Hadrian, was able to understand these localities, to speak about specific parts of public entertainment, sports, athletics, and to recognize the rituals therein. And I think that's really quite remarkable that the emperor should be able to speak so confidently to these different regions all across that and then respond so proactively.
Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, another wonderful document that we have is a record of Marcus Aurelius lowering the prices of gladiators across the empire. But again, he sets it in the sort of petition and response. The high priests of Gaul have come to me and they have asked that I remove this tax. What it also happens to be just after he's put down a revolt and he's declared peace on earth and the wars are over. And so the first thing these guys do, okay, now give us a tax break. And Marcus Aurelius says yes, but again, with incredible detail, laying out, what the prices of gladiators are going to be in a big city and a small city, and what happens if you don't raid at all, and how do you go figure out what the income is. I mean, there's a lot of very fine-grained, detailed knowledge that goes into making these policies, and you can often see that the point of the imperial official is to go and work with the local authority and try to do so in a reasonable kind of way, as we could see with the Corinthians and the governor there. The governor isn't just going and saying, you have to do this. Let's find a way of making this work. In Pliny's letters, we can see the same thing, is that he gets tied up in these very difficult local matters and he writes off to Trajan for advice. But what he can't do is come in and start chopping off heads.
Yeah. And again, I think sometimes from a popular perspective, we tend to focus on Romans and we see the legions and we imagine, the notable incidents, Battle of the Graupian Mountains, that sort of stuff. But actually so much of Rome is about engaging really closely with different populations, different cultures, and trying to create some kind of hybrid identity. And I think that the example from Hadrian and also Trajan and Marcus Aurelius as well is in many ways, each of them are very useful in framing that sense of discourse. And of course, if someone's able to say, well, I'm responding to you, you've asked for something, and now I'm going to change everything, it of course creates a really strong connection between the people and their ruler, even if partly it could be controlled by a circle around that emperor. It creates that form of dialogue, which I think is so important in understanding imperial power.
No, that's absolutely right. And again, when we look sort of beyond the frontier of the empire, often a war is not the first option.
Yeah.
What you're trying to do is negotiate buffer zones with the people north of the empire, along the Rhine and the Danube. You're trying to spread influence north to prevent any kind of major difficulties. The Roman wars with Parthia, again, when you think about the amount of time that we're looking at, there are really not very many of them. And the Roman response is often here's a large raiding expedition. We're going to go sack the capital of the Parthian Empire, and then we're going to come home again, and there'll be some minor readjustment of the border. But this is the way that we expect the system to work. That what we're going to do is replace a regime that hasn't worked with us with one that will work with us, but in return, the soldiers come home.
And so often I think, we look at the borders of Rome and we think, well, that's where Rome stops. But of course, it never does. Beyond those borders, there are merchants, there are members and people who might categorize themselves as Roman. There is very strong Roman influence, even beyond these kind of established borders. And again, I think that allows us to frame how this kind of system seems to work. For, like you said at the beginning, you know, it's remarkable that the empire survives for so very long.
Yes, and I think that, you know, the lesson that we should take away from this is that a successful system of government is one that is responsive to the needs of the people who are governed by it. And you know, we tend to think of imperial systems as not working that way. We tend to think of, you know, using later European models, you know, of the king with the divine right, and he simply tells you what to do. And that the opposition to that, with the theories of John Locke and people like that, is humans emerge from a state of nature and they create a society and they give up some rights for benefits, is complete opposition to monarchy. Whereas in the Roman system, monarchy is justified by the benefits that it provides for the society.
Yeah.
And
again,
so it really is sort of the opposite of the later European model.
It invites a really, I think, different perspective on Rome and how it works, and certainly focusing on Hadrian allows us to do that. So you've already I've got two last questions for you, David, if that's okay. You've already answered the first mostly anyway, but I'll ask it again. How would you define imperial power in the Roman world?
As a dialogue between the central government and its subjects.
Excellent, and I would entirely agree with that.
I mean, the emperor.
I think that works very well.
You know, the emperor will tell you what to do, but it's not random.
Yeah, good. And there is that kind of mechanism and almost pro forma that can guide that. And my final question is more from a student perspective, David. So partly in shaping your talk, you're engaging with these letters by emperors to different elements across the Roman world. As a student of ancient history, how should you engage with those? How can you decipher them to try and understand what's really going on?
I think that the key question that I always ask, and I ask my students always to ask, is why would somebody say something like that? What is the expectation that somebody would have? And so to enter yourself into a dialogue with the document, sort of, why are you saying that? And what does it mean that somebody should think that this works? And if we do that, then we allow the ancient world to speak to us, and we're going to learn a lot more from it that way.
Excellent. And again, that echoes partly how you define imperial power, dialogue, and we've got to closely engage with the evidence and contextualize it.
Yeah.
You know, every single time, I guess, when we can.
It's so much more interesting to be engaging with a person in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, David. So all I have to say, and on behalf of myself and the university, but also, of course, the people watching and hopefully the students watching as well, is a huge thank you. That was a fascinating talk, a wonderful guide through the complex networks of imperial power, and it offers, I think, a really important new perspective on the nature of what it was to be a Roman emperor. So thank you, David.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you today.